Hey guys, welcome back to the next installment of Fulfilled. And the title of this session is The King of the North, Fulfilled. Now, I've actually skipped a session. I was going to do a session and it would have probably flowed a little bit better. I guess we'll see. But I was going to do a session on the covenant with death in Daniel chapter 9, as well as the Abrahamic Accords. This is something that I've wanted to talk about for quite some time. And as I said, it probably would have flowed better. But in light of this recent massive tectonic shift in the Middle East of the ouster of Bashar al-Assad, the brutal regime of the Ba'athist regime of Assad, and its replacement with what is essentially an Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, Daesh, ISIS, however you want to say it, replacement. Basically, Al-Qaeda has taken over a country. Everyone is asking, everyone wants a geopolitical analysis, a biblical, a prophetic analysis. And so we're going to do a little bit of that, but we're going to focus in on Daniel chapter 11 in particular. That's our primary text that we're going to look at. Now, let me just say this, because again, we're going to talk about this in another session, but with President Trump being elected, the issue of the Abrahamic Accords is going to be huge because that was his son-in-law Kirshner's, brainchild or baby, so to speak. So there's going to be a big push, diplomatic push from the United States after Trump gets into office to continue to expand this peace project called the Abraham Accords. Now, the most specific emphasis will of course be on Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that just a little bit at the end of this session, but we're really going to zero in on that. And obviously, I have a real passion and go to Saudi Arabia pretty regularly. So I have a real passion to sort of understand what's happening there, and I know everyone else does as well. So as I said, we're going to begin with Daniel chapter 11. So now, to be very clear, Daniel chapter 11 is part of a prophecy which includes Daniel chapters 10, 11, and 12. The chapters were added much later, okay? They're not in the original text. Sometimes chapter breaks can be confusing, sometimes they can be helpful. But it's very important that when we really study this whole prophecy, we study it all together. It's one contiguous, unbroken prophecy. For the sake of time and brevity, we're going to start here in Daniel chapter 11, verse 1, because it is kind of a thought or a break here to help us. So you have this angel who's sort of guiding Daniel through these things. I'm not even sure. I have to look it up which angel this is. But he says, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him." It's interesting. "And now I will tell you the truth." So the prophecy starts out in verse 1. It anchors it in history with the rulership of a particular historical king, Darius the Mede. So in ancient history, you had the Medo-Persian Empire that came after the Babylonian Empire. After Babylon fell, the Medes and the Persians, which together, two different ethnic people groups, but together they formed sort of a co-leadership over this empire. And it was specifically in the first year of Darius the Mede. Now, of course, with all these things, there's going to be all sorts of academic debate, but we can pin this down in history. Again, there's going to be some debate, but we can pretty much pin down the general time frame or even the year of Darius the Mede's rule. So it anchors it in history. Okay. Then in verse 2, he says, "Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia." Okay, so in the same empire, after Darius, you would have 1, 2, 3 more Persian kings in succession. Okay, a straight line of successorship. And then he says, "And then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece." Okay, so again, history records that the Medo-Persian Empire swept across the whole Middle East, except they were going west, and they reached and actually clashed with the Greeks, if you will, and actually extended the rule all the way up into Europe. It's an amazing giant empire. Okay, and then in verse 3, it says this, "And a mighty king will arise." Okay, so you've got Darius the Mede, 1, 2, 3 Persian kings, then another. He was the one that really expanded the Medo-Persian Empire. But then out of the Grecian Empire comes a mighty king. Now, academic consensus among scholars, among commentators, is that this is speaking of Alexander the Great. And that lines up exactly with history, and it lines up exactly with the descriptions of him here in the text. Okay, we all know Alexander the Great. He's not the first king of Greece or Macedonia by any means, but he was really the first king when Greece became an empire. He's the first greatest of all of the Greek kings. He unified all these different little, not really dynasties, I guess you would just call them these little mini kingdoms. He unified them all, and then he leveraged them all and defeated the Medo-Persian Empire. So, but then it says in verse 4, but as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. So as soon as he becomes great, his kingdom gets broken up. You go, what happened? Well, Alexander the Great died really young and rather suddenly. It's an amazing military conquest, but he died suddenly. If you're not familiar, then you can see the movie, all right? But, again, the prophecy starts out in history. One contiguous line. It shifts empires, but it still is just a singular line of succession of rulers over the area. But then suddenly he dies, and it says his empire is broken up into 4, or at least it's broken up toward the 4 points of heaven. Okay, now the history records that when Alexander the Great died, immediately there was something like 26 different potential successors or diadochi. Okay, in the Greek, it's the successors, just diadochi. You'll often hear that when you're reading about these folks, even in Bible commentaries and prophecy books and this sort of thing. Just means his successors. But after a bunch of wrangling and intrigue and all of these things and some wars, pretty quickly, these empires, it boiled down to really 4 or 5 major empires. Okay, so you had Lysimachus, Cassander, the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, and the Antigonid Empire. Or you could even throw Antipater in there, and then you'd have 6. But really, there was a handful of these different dynasties. Okay, and then after, again, 10, 20 years of wars and battles, and these dynasties are always moving and evolving, eventually, there were really 2 primary. Again, there were a couple other little small dynasties, but there were 2 primary dynasties. And that's the Seleucid, or Seleucid, in the north, and the Ptolemaic in the south. Okay? So you really had those 2. Now, I'm going to look at a diagram here. It's just to diagram exactly what I've just said. The prophecy begins in verse 1. You start out with Darius the Mede. Then in verse 2, it's Persian kings. And we still have just this one contiguous line of succession of kings. But then when you get to verse 3, you have Alexander the Great. Verse 4, he dies. And by the way, this is the same thing as Daniel chapter 8. The same thing as Daniel chapter 8. First, you have this 2-horned goat, or actually he's a ram from Medo-Persia, and he clashes with this shaggy goat that has 1 horn. That's Alexander the Great from the west, and then they clash, and then the prominent horn is broken off, and 4 horns come up in place of the 1. This is the same thing that it's talking about here. His kingdom is parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. Again, there were much more than 4, but the Bible focuses on the 4 because they were the primary ones. Okay, but then you see here that in verse 5 and forward, Daniel chapter 11 only focuses on these 2 dynasties. The Seleucid, again, in the north, the Ptolemaic in the south. We're going to look at a map here in a moment. Okay, and it focuses on those 2, and then it just really traces all of these various kings from the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic dynasties, and there were many, but it refers to them from this point forward as the king of the north and the king of the south. So when Daniel 11 refers to the king of the north, it's talking about the region of modern-day Turkey and Syria and northern Iraq. That's the region from which the king of the north ruled. And then the king of the south was in the region of Egypt, as well as modern-day Sudan and Libya, northeast Africa, right? Okay, now I want to zero in on the part of the prophecy that's most important, because as we follow these kings of the north forward, Daniel 11 then starts focusing on the Antichrist. And the Antichrist is called the king of the north. And he's a ruler from the region, again, of Turkey, Syria, northern Iraq. as I always joke, the tri-state area. Okay, but as usual within the world of biblical interpretation and particularly biblical prophecy, there's going to be all kinds of different opinions, and that is definitely true, and there's plenty of controversy with regard to these several verses. So I'm going to read verse 35, and then I'm going to skip forward to verse 40 through 45. Then the king will do as he pleases. Okay, so most commentators will say that at verse 34, earlier and previous to that, it was talking about the historical Greek king, the 8th king of the Seleucid dynasty, in Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And then commentators will say, but then at verse 35, it transitions and it starts speaking about the Antichrist. That Antiochus Epiphanes is a shadow, a type, a historical picture of the Antichrist. And so the prophecy just kind of flows and bleeds from speaking of him right into speaking of his last days' ultimate fulfillment or referent. So the king will do as he pleases. He'll do whatever he wants. And he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and he will speak monstrous things against the God of the Bible. People often say that the Antichrist will claim to be the God of the Bible. How can you claim to be the God of the Bible if you are speaking against God? He doesn't claim to be the God of the Bible. He speaks against the God of the Bible and tries to exalt himself above the God of the Bible. He does claim essentially to be God by sitting in God's seat in the temple. But as we read later, that he does have a God. It actually says here in Daniel 11 that he has a God that he honors. We're not going to get into all those details. He will speak monstrous things against the God of gods, and he will prosper. Like, he will prosper. You go, I don't believe in the prosperity gospel. Good. It's not talking about you. It's talking about the Antichrist. The Antichrist will prosper until indignation is finished, until the time of the Lord's chastisement, as he's purifying and purging and leading unto salvation of his own people, the purification of his bride, the purification and salvation of Israel, until indignation is finished. And of course, the judgment against the wicked. For that which is decreed will be done. That which is written will come to pass. Skipping forward to verse 40. At the time of the end, now notice here, it just says the king of the south. So we're dealing with these historical clashes, this historical conflict. So basically you had Antiochus Epiphanes ruled the region, again, in modern day parts of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And he was in conflict with the, again, Greek king that was ruling the area of Egypt. Well, who gets caught in the middle? Israel, caught in the middle. Here I am, stuck in the middle. You know, clowns to the left of me, Antichrist above me, unfaithful betrayers to myself. So Israel gets caught in the middle, right? And historically, this is what happened. Antiochus Epiphanes invaded Israel. He made Torah illegal. He slaughtered, I believe it was over 40,000 people. He exiled as prisoners of war another 40,000. It's all recorded in the apocryphal books of Maccabees. It tells that whole story, or you can read about it in any number of history books. Okay, and that becomes a pattern, a type for the Antichrist. Antiochus also sacrificed a pig on the Temple Mount as a historical foreshadow of the abomination that causes desolation. Okay, so it says at the end time, at the time of the end, the king of the south. So you go, well, wait a minute. We're dealing with the history, a couple hundred years before Jesus. The Greek kings are clashing. Well, then the prophecy of Daniel pushes that picture to the end. Okay, so it's a pattern. I've said this multiple times. Prophecy is pattern. And when you have a fulfillment, what looks like it's the final fulfillment, it may not always be the final fulfillment. And these events in history are part of the pattern, but it uses that pattern as the picture for the last days. So at the end time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots. So with every translation, this is the operative sentence that everyone debates over. Because what a lot of people do is they just say, well, there's a new guy, just a him, the king, that will do as he pleases. And they say that the king of the north and the king of the south are in conflict with this third guy. And I admit that depending on how you translate, this particular translation leans in that direction. Depending on how you translate, it is a bit confusing. But I would argue that taking that position, which introduces 3 kings, as opposed to 2 throughout the entirety after verse 21, when you introduce a 3rd king, you completely break up the flow of the entire chapter. You end up causing massive contradictions with other texts, such as Ezekiel 38 and 39, as well as Zechariah 12 through 14, because they're all talking about the same things, as well as Joel chapter 3 and Daniel 8 and Daniel 7 and Daniel 2 and so many other texts. Okay, I'll explain to you why people often insert this 3rd king. And it's ultimately because of the assumption, the false assumption of a Roman Antichrist. Quite frankly, because if you look at this text and just read it at face value, which is a conflict between the king of the north and the king of the south throughout the whole text. That's what it was historically, and that's what it continues to be in the last days, that when you add a 3rd king, you end up again with confusion. When you accept that the king of the north is the Antichrist, everything flows. Everything just flows together very smoothly. The problem for some people is that means the Antichrist comes from the region of Turkey and Syria. Okay? I've been saying this for 20 years. So when you come with an eschatological, prophetic prejudice or assumption and go, but we know the Antichrist comes from Rome, from Europe, therefore the king of the north can't be the Antichrist, you end up sowing complete confusion into the narrative. When you accept that the Antichrist actually does come from Israel's neighbors, and then when it talks about the king of the north here, it's talking about the same guy that Ezekiel 38 and 39 is talking about, calls him Gog, or it's talking about the same invading entities in Zechariah, or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Chaldeans in Joel chapter 3, etc. Everything flows together smoothly. This is very, very important. And it's emerging as really clear now in light of what's happening in Syria. So it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south will collide with who? The king of the north. And then the king of the north will storm out against him, the king of the south, with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. He'll enter countries, overflow them, pass through. So notice this. I want you to notice this. This is very important. If this is Julani or Gulani, I'm not sure exactly how to say it, by the way, this individual that's the leader of this terrorist network in Syria that took over, his name basically means he's from the Golan. Okay, Golani, but in Arabic it might be Gulani. I'm not even exactly sure. I just want to be very clear. This is not former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani's cousin. It's not Giuliani, it's Gulani. Giuliani. Okay, sorry. So notice this. This individual floods through many countries, just like Antiochus Epiphanes conquered all sorts of areas and then eventually invaded Israel. Likewise, the last days king of the north will be busy conquering other Muslim nations before it deals with Israel. There are other wars first. Okay? It says that he'll enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. He'll even enter the beautiful land. There's the land of Israel. And many countries will fall. Many other countries besides Israel will fall to the Antichrist. But these will be rescued out of his hand. Edom, Moab, and the foremost sons of Ammon, that's modern-day Jordan. It seems as though Jordan will escape being conquered by the Antichrist. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. The land of Egypt will fall. The Ptolemaic regions, the former regions of the Ptolemaic kingdom or dynasty, will fall to the last days, king of the north. But he will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt. And then Libya, and it says the Ethiopians or Sudan, will also then submit to him. Okay, so when he conquers Egypt, the surrounding nations will then also pledge their allegiance to this regional conquering king. But rumors from the east and the north will disturb him. Hello, China. Hello, Russia. Okay, somehow rumors or news from the north and the east. We don't know if it's Russia or China, but that seems to be a pretty easy answer beforehand. And then he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He'll pitch his tents of his royal pavilion between the sea in the beautiful holy mountain. So this individual will eventually occupy. He will have an occupying presence in the land of Israel. But he'll come to his end and no one will help him. In other words, he will die. Okay? This is where he dies. Now, let me just say this very briefly because this is not really the topic of this subject. But as I said, when you read various commentaries, modern commentators, some of them will interpret Daniel 11 as there being a third king. Okay, I call this the three-king interpretation, where they insert the Antichrist as another individual. So you have the king of the north, the king of the south, and then another king. Okay, so some commentators will take that position, and then others will hold to the two-king interpretation. To be very clear, I'm adamant that the two-king interpretation is the only interpretation that does not violate the flow of the entire chapter and that does not cause it to be contradictory to so many other texts. There's numerous problems. I've actually got a article about this on my website, a free article. If you go to free resources and click on Daniel, there's a article there called Daniel 11, Two Kings or Three, or something like this. But the point that I want to make, just one side point, the three-king interpretation, you cannot find it until modern times. It did not exist in history. No one inserted a third king. And I'm telling you, the reason that many people have done it is because of the Roman Antichrist prejudice or assumption. Okay, so in history, in terms of I went back and looked at everyone that I can find. I may have missed some, but you've got Hippolytus of Rome. He held to the two-king interpretation. Victorinus, Lactantius, Ephraim, the Syrian, John Chrysostom, Jerome, Theodoret of Syria, interestingly enough. And then in more modern, moving up to post-Reformation, Isaac Newton, John Gill, then John Wesley, Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, S.P. Tregelles, one of my favorite brethren, early brethren writers, Carl Friedrich Keil of the Keil and Delitzsch, the German commentators, and John Nelson Darby. John Nelson Darby took the two-king interpretation, okay? So the three-king interpretation is a new interpretation. It didn't start until probably the late 1800s, or I'm not even sure, I'd have to look. But it's much more of a modern interpretation, again, because people were assuming a Roman Antichrist, and that false assumption will cause you to just mess up the whole chapter. Okay, so let's go ahead and just look at a map. So this is it just says Hellenistic world, 3rd century BC. But here you basically have the Seleucid dynasty or kingdom in the north. And it went all the way, as you can see, all the way over to India. I mean, it was massive. But its primary focus was Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq. Okay, yes, it expanded a bit over into Iran, but this is really big. And then in the south, they're in sort of the turquoise-ish color, you've got the Ptolemaic dynasty. Again, that's Egypt extending all the way over there to Libya, along the northern coast of Africa. Okay, so this is what Daniel 11 is speaking of. The king of the north and the king of the south. And then it projects it into the last days. Now, obviously, this is a huge issue. I want to show you a picture of Israeli, is he the president or the prime minister? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Yeah. And this was him at the UN just recently. And he's holding up a map of sort of the new Middle East, the nations that are friendly to Israel versus the countries that are adversarial. And he calls it the curse. And there he's got basically Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Now, of course, he should include Yemen in that because the Houthis down on the southern bit of the Arabian Peninsula were sort of part of that curse. They were sending in rockets into Israel. And then on the other side, he has the blessing. And notice, look at, he includes Saudi Arabia. He has Egypt. He has Sudan. And interestingly enough, yeah, he's got Jordan. Okay, he's got Jordan in there, and he calls that the blessing. Netanyahu, again, this is several weeks ago at the time of this recording, is holding up a map of Daniel chapter 11, except he doesn't even realize it. He's holding up a map of modern-day geopolitical nations that are enemies of Israel versus those that are, because of the Abrahamic Accords, partially becoming much more friendly to Israel, right? Because with the Abrahamic Accords, we don't have Saudi yet, but we're getting close. And listen, guys, when you monitor this with Saudi Arabia, one week they're going to say something real friendly about Israel. The next week they're going to criticize Israel. One week they're going to say something bad about the Palestinians. The next week they're going to defend the Palestinians. Don't worry about that. That's just Middle Eastern politics. They're going to get there. Trust me, they are going to get there. Okay, so with the Abrahamic Accords, you had the UAE, United Arab Emirates, joined. You had Bahrain joined. Morocco joined. Sudan joined. The previous peace treaties, the only two nations that had peace treaties with Israel was Jordan and Egypt. Okay, going back to the Oslo Accords. I mean, going back even further than that. Okay, so you have some friendly nations. They have peace agreements with Israel. They have more friendly relations, relatively speaking. And then you have those that are just trying to destroy Israel. Here's Netanyahu holding up a map that is basically a map of Daniel 11. Yeah, it's a little bit different, but for the most part, it's spot on. Now, I've got a picture here of Mohammed bin Salman, not even 40 yet, and he will become the king of Saudi Arabia, this revolutionary leader who is reforming the kingdom. He's changed the kingdom in so many ways. If not for him, I would not be regularly able to visit Saudi Arabia as I am. By the way, let me just point out that I do have tours coming up. May as well mention that. But it's actually going to be Saudi, Jordan, and then we're going to go into Israel. We're tracing the path of the Exodus and exploring sites that are all related to the Exodus. It's going to be super cool. And I actually have another one coming up in April, doing the 7 churches in Turkey. So if you're able to come, it's a great time to come. And actually, it's very safe in Saudi Arabia if you're ever worried about that. But here you have this, again, transformative leader, and he's moving toward normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Think about this. Saudi Arabia is the heart of Islam, the home of Mecca and Medina. To be in friendly relations with Israel, the heart of Judaism, and in many ways sacred to, obviously to us as believers, Bible believers, of Jerusalem. That Jerusalem and Mecca could actually become friends for a short time. That's a fascinating prospect. Okay? But then we had, again, Julani. It's amazing, this particular picture here. I'm not sure what mosque this is. I probably should have looked it up. It might be the White Mosque in Damascus. I'm not sure, but it just is so reminiscent of when Baghdadi was standing in that massive mosque in Mosul when he declared the Islamic State. It looks so incredibly similar. But so here's this guy. He's this new leader that suddenly has arisen in Syria. Now listen, I've always said, to be clear, that the Antichrist has to come. Most people hear me say Turkey. I always say Turkey or Syria or northern Iraq, that general area. The scriptures seem to emphasize Turkey in a really significant way, particularly in Ezekiel 38 and 39. But other places it refers to him as the Assyrian. It doesn't mean that he's ethnically Assyrian necessarily, but he's from the region of the former Assyrian Empire. Other places it refers to him as the Chaldean, or the Babylonian. So I always think it's important for us to be careful. Is it possible that Julani is the king of the north? It's possible. Could he be the Yeah, it's possible. Could he get killed by Israel tomorrow? It's possible. I have no idea. But he does meet some of the more important biblical criteria. Will we see this sort of Al-Qaeda project land and be established? Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say. We don't know the future. So with all of these things, we see these things coming together, and it looks like prophecy is finally coming to its final fruition, or it could just be another pattern, another echo. Like these events rhyme with events in history, and they rhyme with what will ultimately happen. But they may not be the final fulfillment, or they may be. We have to hold these things very carefully. It's so dangerous to say, this is that. I declare, this is the guy. I just stay away from that type of talk. Everyone who has that belief, for so many years, there was a fellow that I met many years ago when I first started in ministry, and he was just convinced that Assad is the Antichrist, to the point where his followers would get really angry, and they would attack me on social media, like, you don't know anything, Assad's the Antichrist. And I'm like, well, just wait and see. It's like you don't argue about speculative future prophetic realities. And of course, I haven't looked at any of their social media to see how they're dealing with the removal of Assad. They're probably expecting him to come back or something. Now, let me just say this with regard to Turkey, because this is so important. I've been talking about Turkey, saying watch Turkey forever. To understand what's happened in Syria, now I just want to talk sort of geopolitics. You had Assad. He was really the last of the great Middle Eastern dictators, autocrats, like up there with Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and Mubarak, and all of Salah was down there in Yemen. They were all removed. You could say by the Arab Spring, you could say by the United States CIA. It's kind of a bit of both. Okay, but so throughout, I would say, the Reagan era, like the American foreign policy in the Middle East, our approach was very simple. Prop up these different autocrats, these strongmen, as we call them. And they're generally going to be horrible when it comes to human rights, treating minorities in their countries, not something we would ever want to actually say we support, but we let it happen because these guys have the chutzpah to crush groups like Al-Qaeda and these different radical Islamist or Muslim Brotherhood movements. Okay, I think of Hafez Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father. That guy pretty much leveled a city. Like he pretty much turned a city into a parking lot and killed his rivals. Like they will crush these rebellions and thus ultimately establish a measure of peace. It's a painful peace, especially now as we've seen Assad's prisons, which were nightmare torture chambers of horror, like hundreds of thousands of people put through living hell in these dungeons for all intents and purposes. But they did establish a measure of peace. I say peace, stability, even for minorities. Okay, so that was our approach. However, with Obama, when Obama came into power, there was a transition into a completely different philosophy. Now, whether or not this was Obama's brainchild or, the State Department or Hillary Clinton, of course, she was the Secretary of State under Obama, I'm not sure. But in light of the fact that Obama was actually, grew up Muslim and had a much more friendly attitude toward Islam than previous presidents, I actually think it very well may have been his idea. And I'll be honest with you, it was not a horrible idea, but it did fail miserably. So basically, when Obama came in back then, okay, Erdogan was probably the prime minister of Turkey at the time, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the current president of Turkey. I mean, he's been in power for now like 20 years-ish. It's been quite a while. Turkey was much more moderate, especially the years leading up to Obama. And it was a democratically elected Islamist government, but it was very mild. So, again, American foreign policy makers looked at Turkey and they go, why should we prop up all of these brutal dictators? Why don't we establish democratically elected leaders throughout the Middle East? Let's replicate the Turkish model. And look, in Turkey, they don't vote for radicals. They don't vote for ISIS. They vote for moderates. Just look at the Turkish government. That was the argument. And so with that said, Obama and Hillary proceeded to basically overthrow all of these dictators. So Mubarak in Egypt was absolutely overthrown by the CIA. Morsi did not win the election. That's beside the point. They let the Muslim Brotherhood win the election. You had Gaddafi in Libya. I mean, the guy literally, his life ended with them. He was hiding in a tunnel under a street. He ran and crawled into a drainage ditch, tried crawling in the tunnel. They pulled him out, killed him, and literally stuck a rifle up his rear end. That was the work of Hillary Clinton. People that we had formerly supported and put into power, we then turned on and executed. It was brutal. It was horrible. Well, of course, the Islamists took over Libya, and how's that going? Okay, and so what's interesting is we started that approach and then suddenly realized this was the wrong approach. This was a horrible approach. And, Hillary and Obama will never take responsibility for it. But notice this, they let the Muslim Brotherhood get into power, and within 1 year, the Egyptians threw him off, and they put in Sisi, who is really just Mubarak light. He's another dictator, another military dictator. And he'll probably stay in power until another dictator comes along. Okay, so that was the approach throughout the Middle East, right? Assad was kind of the last of all of these dictators, but he is an Alawite, and his people, the Alawites, they're a minority in the country, but they ruled the country for many years. But the Alawites are a sect of Shia Islam. Shia Islam. So the Iranians, okay, they have extended their control throughout the Middle East by using proxies. So they established Hezbollah in Lebanon. Their man in Syria was Assad, right? They have the Houthis down in Yemen. then they would also work with Hamas and so forth. So they're always using their spidery octopus tentacles to try to surround Israel. Well, just overnight, Israel has just dismantled Iran's entire project for the past like 30 years. Like, it's brutal what they did. And then Syria falls, Assad's out. Now he fled to Moscow. He'll be housed, I guess, by Russia. Must have had that planned beforehand. Okay, so now you have this sudden transition where the age of these autocrats is over, and Al-Qaeda has taken over. Guys, this is ISIS. This is not ISIS took over Raqqa and Mosul. This is ISIS has taken over Syria. But get this, they've been fully supported by Turkey. Well, wait a minute. I thought Turkey was going moderate. No, they have turned more Islamist over these recent years, and they've supported the group that has taken over Syria and other groups in Syria, which are basically ISIS. I mean, they actually wear the ISIS patches on their sleeves, and they're going to start trying to slaughter the Kurds. Okay, so this is a big deal. Now, if this continues, and they, are very proud of their new sort of, just like ISIS was, they'll declare a caliphate, and they'll begin slowly trying to expand and conquer other kingdoms, other nations, just like it says in Daniel chapter 11. So is it something to watch? Absolutely. I've actually got a map here of what's called Greater Turkey. I mean, they're like flashing this map up, acting like, hey, Turkey is just expanded. They're viewing this as an expansion of Turkey, Turkish imperialism, okay, kind of ruling and controlling the whole Middle East. So this is a tectonic shift. Israel has effectively neutralized Iran. Not neutralized, but drastically diminished Iran. There's no question about it. And the black horse of Turkey has stepped forward. I've been saying this and predicting it, as I said, for 20 years. The real greatest danger in the Middle East, it's always been Turkey, the king of the north. Okay, so whether or not the Antichrist comes from Turkey or Syria, I'm very open. And I think it's very important that we avoid getting into speculation too much. It's okay to say maybe, but let's not get caught up. Like, Christians are weird when it comes to Antichrist pointing. They always want to be kind of the one that called it long before anyone else. Don't worry about being the one. God's not impressed, and you don't win any money. So just be humble, be patient. But guys, let me just say this. Is this the final ultimate fulfillment? It could be. We don't know that it is. But when I look at pictures like this, again, Netanyahu in the UN giving a speech, holding up Daniel 11, and then only weeks later seeing this massive shift to where Syria falls, exactly like in a way that we would expect, that empowers Turkey, that empowers the Islamists. It's clear that prophecy is being fulfilled, and it's moving in the direction of its ultimate, final fulfillment. And this very well could be the start of it. It very well could be, but it might not be. We need to be humble. We need to be careful. Okay, amen, guys. God bless. I hope that was helpful. As I said, in the next session, I'm going to jump into the issue of the Abrahamic Accords and the covenant with death. So God bless you all. Have a fantastic week. And Maranatha.